Hello out there, Ricecast family. You can hear it. You can hear the sound of podcast breaking through the echoing silence that has been the summer break here on the Ricecast. I've heard from so many of you, those of you that have camped outside of my home, to say, where are our Ricecasts, Anthony? It's a bit far, but I appreciate the devotion, Pastor. I'll tell you that. This is the kind of fans that we have out there.
Yep, tens of people have been camping outside your home. Yeah. If that's you, you really need help that we can't give you on this podcast.
Camped outside. Where are the Ricecasts? Give them to us, you coward. They haven't been there. We're making one right now, though, family. We're back. Pastor Willie is here. We are here. We're doing it. We're back at the Ricecast. Pastor, how are you?
It's good. And, it has been a busy summer, and I think you had some time off, well-deserved. You were traveling some, and Cheryl and I traveled some, and then we kind of didn't, we're going at the same time. And so anyway, it's good to be back, and looking forward to a busy fall and a great fall here at Calvary.
Yes. Let's talk just for a minute. Let's update everybody, because we have this in common. I don't know if we've talked on the podcast. We are both national park participants. We like to go visit national parks. So did you go to a national park when you were away?
Yes. We hit 3 this summer. It's kind of, Cheryl and I, has become a hobby through the years, and people know us. It became one of those things, everybody needs something to release, and we love traveling, and we love the outdoors and hiking. Mm-hmm. And so a couple of years ago, we just started, we were going to someone in the summer, and we started talking about all the ones we've been through. Well, I wonder how many we've been through. We counted up. It's like 18 or something. Wow, I wonder how many there are. So you start counting up, and at that time there were like 61. I think today is 63, if I'm correct. And so I've become quite an expert, as you can tell. And they keep adding them. That's what keeps messing it up. But anyway, then I started doing the math. I'm a planner, and I'm going, that actually is one of those real goals that I could, and we, maybe what if we visited all of them? Yeah, which is going to be very hard to do for reasons I won't go into here, because of some of them are quite remote. The ones in Alaska are quite remote. Sure, but in any case, I started thinking, gosh, if you hit 2 or 3, and then what happens is once you know about them all, you start when you go on a trip or somewhere for some other reason, you might go, hey, there's one an hour away. Let's check it out. So we've been gradually checking them off. Yeah. We have been to 42 of the 63 national parks, and this year we had 3, actually 4 this year that we went to.
So that's on top of the 40-something you already been to, or your number now is?
Our number now is 42.
42. That is so impressive. Yeah, that's a big goal.
It's just one of those kind of fun little things. I love Lord willing, and it gives you an intentionality sometimes in traveling. And of course, these are beautiful places anyway. Yeah. And so we've been to 42, and hopefully, the Lord willing, maybe it's kind of a life goal. What if I could go to all of them? But the America Samoa is quite remote, and that's a national park, the America Samoa.
Now, where's that one?
In Samoa, which is an island in the South Pacific. So it's the American Samoa. That's the name of the island. The
listeners tune in for the geography expertise of the Ricecast. Where would you find the Florida Everglades? Where would one look to find a Florida Everglade?
And then there's some in Alaska that literally you can only get to by plane. Like you'd have to hire a guide. And it's like you can't drive in. Right. So I don't know why those are parks. Those should just be like monuments or something. But in any case, we'll try to update you. But we went to the Dakotas on our vacation. Yeah. And we saw there are 3 between North and South Dakota. And we went to those 3. And then we had hit 1 in Kentucky right before that, earlier in the year.
Is there anybody up there in the Dakotas?
There are wonderful people in the Dakotas.
It wasn't just you two.
There were many people. And we really loved Rapid City. Okay. It's a great city. And and really just one of, I came away thinking, some states maybe they're overrated, right? And underrated. You know how you play that game. Well, the Dakotas would be underrated. These are states that fly under the radar, but they're quite beautiful. And now I didn't go in February, mind you. Right. But of course. They're quite beautiful, and and they're not quite as crowded as some of the other places, and we had a great time. Yeah.
Hot take. Underrated, the Dakotas.
The Dakotas are underrated.
That is a great take. No, that's good to hear. Yeah, I don't know much about there. I know you told me you were doing that. I'll give you mine. We're nowhere near that. I think we're probably at 10 national parks, if I were to say. Oh, before I get into that, the Dry Tortugas, is that one you have to get out to?
Yes, you have to take a boat.
A boat.
It's off the Keys. If you go to Key West, you'd get a boat, and they take you out there.
Right.
But it's not hard to get a boat. They go out every day.
Have you done that one?
Yes.
Okay, you did that one.
Yes.
This, another podcast for another time is how does it become, who's deciding this distant part of Alaska better be a national park?
Well, that was Jimmy Carter, actually. I just got through reading a biography. I know we didn't plan to talk about this, but actually Jimmy Carter, under his administration, and it was quite unpopular at the time. Mm-hmm. It seems like everything he did was unpopular, and his, even the people in Alaska were angry. But he used some kind of law to just kind of mark off, that is, or reserve, hundreds of thousands of acres in Alaska. And so they actually have 6 national parks in Alaska. And a couple of them you can visit pretty easily, but there's about 3 of them that are quite remote. And the only way you would drive to an area and then rent, a private plane, and a backpacker, and they would take you to the Gates of the Arctic is one of them. You can't drive there. So I don't know why it's a park. Is that a park if you can't drive there? If I were president, I would change that. It's not a park unless you can drive there. That's just
Gates of the Arctic. It's called
Gates of the Arctic National Park, and then there's
that sounds like a part of the Pilgrim's Progress. That sounds mythological to me.
It's quite
Gates of
remote.
the Arctic.
Like they fly you in, drop you off, warn you about the grizzly bears, and wish you got there. And that's kind of. And you may or may not be there when they come back. It's that's the kind of deal. And so I don't know that I'll make the Gates of the Arctic.
Maybe not. If that is the scenario, we'd maybe prefer you don't try to squeeze that one in. That is fun. That is interesting. I'm going to start. You said when you're president, I'm going to start in the beautiful city of Largo, which is where I hail from. I want to make Walsingham Park a national park. That's going to be my push because you can drive to it.
You can drive,
so it checks that box.
You do need a few other boxes besides.
It's got
drivable.
A beautiful lake that we have there. Okay. So if you want to vote for me for Largo City Commission 2059, we're going to make Walsingham Park a national park, and you can cross that off your list so easy. We would welcome
that
you
would be pretty easy to cross
with open arms. So we went and visited some national parks. Oh, we did Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons. That's
Great
where
ones.
we did.
Fantastic. My son went there this summer. And,
did he really?
Yeah. Those are 2 of the great. Well, my wife and I do all these lists, like our top 10, or the top 10 that were most underrated, or top 10 surprises. But by any measurement, Yellowstone is one of the greatest.
Yeah, very, very.
And
beautiful.
the Tetons is obviously spectacular.
Yeah. It was great. Great time had by all. Let's talk about this quickly because we have some stuff I want to talk about today, but I feel like there's some other things we got to catch up on, maybe some house cleaning stuff we got to do. We are starting a lot of things going on here at Calvary. We're about to get into a lot of different things rolling up here. So as we record this is a Wednesday. This coming Sunday is August 8th, and that is our Group Connect Sunday. Mm-hmm. So this is our time to plug into groups. You can get connected in a group. A lot of our groups are kicking off this Sunday, which is a great thing.
It just means we're going to give you a lot of information about groups. It's not like, I got to go to an event. No, it's just in the worship. We're going to give you a lot of information. We really want to re-engage our Sunday morning on-campus connection opportunities. There are plenty of great groups that meet off Sunday morning. That's fine. But we wanted there to be an opportunity for everybody in every age group to be able to connect on Sunday morning while they're there. And so that's one of the big driving forces as we go into the fall, to really invigorate those on-campus Bible study connection groups for every age group and at the same time. So this Sunday, this coming weekend, there'll be a lot of information about that.
Right.
And you'll even have an opportunity, I think, after the service is over to walk into go see the class, maybe meet the teacher, at least go say hello.
That's right.
And just look at that. So this is a great opportunity to get connected. We've all come through a period in which we got forcibly disconnected.
Right.
And so this summer has been about coming back, and now the fall is about, hey, let's get back in a group, let's get connected and go forward.
So that the group Connect this coming Sunday, August 8th. Now our groups will start on August 15th, which is not this coming Sunday, but the following.
Yep.
And on that same Sunday, we're adjusting our Sunday morning schedule just a little bit. For many of us, it'll be just a little change. If you're here at our Clearwater campus, which is where we record the podcast, or at our Seminole campus, the service will be at 10:30 instead of 10. Group hour will be at 9.
Correct. It's at Clearwater and Seminole. We opted to stay with one service for a little while longer. We still, for those of you saying, "I want to go to 2 services," I'm angry. Well, please don't be angry. But we will probably be there. We just didn't want to go there quite this quick yet. We're still looking at how things are coming back and the numbers, and it may be later this fall. It may be by the first of the year, the holidays. But we think we'll be back in 2 services on maybe every campus. I preached at Seminole Sunday. We broadcasted from Seminole,
right.
And it was packed out. Honestly, we're pretty close to needing that. So, but for a few more weeks, going into the fall, for a little while longer, we're going to have one service. As you said, it'll start at 10:30, not 10. This week, last week, it starts at 10.
Right.
But beginning August 15, we'll have one service at 10:30, and our groups hour for every age group, students, children, every age group, is at 9 o'clock. The exception to that is Eastlake, where we're going to go ahead. We just needed to have the 2 service option starting, and so we'll have a service at 8:30. Which is a little earlier than before, but we have an early service at 8:30 and then an 11 o'clock service, and the group's hour is in the middle at 9:45.
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't know how much we've announced this. I'm going to preach the 8:30 live at Eastlake because obviously we can't stream anything.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to that, being able to preach at the Eastlake campus at 8:30 in effect, and then I'll be preaching at the Clearwater campus at 10:30.
Yeah. So that's an exciting thing. I know there's people at our Eastlake family that are, they watch it on the big giant screen there. So it's certainly not hard to see, but it's fun that you're going to get to be there at 8:30 every Sunday. So that'll be fun. So lots of fun stuff getting kicked off here. Remember, that service time switch is August 15th. So if you're listening to this at the end of the current week we're in right now, it won't change just this Sunday. This is still 10 a.m. On the 15th, it goes to 10:30 at Seminole and Clearwater, and 8:30 and 11 at Eastlake will be the worship service.
If you get confused and all that, I'm sure to go to our website, and there will be information about that change front and center. So.
Whole rundown there. So I'll stop us with announcements there. We'll talk more maybe a little bit. We got some fun stuff coming up on Wednesday nights. We got lots of fun stuff rolling out this fall here at Calvary. So it's going to be a good time. Also, and you guys know, if you're Ricecast listeners, how are we not going to address this? The Tampa Bay Lightning won the Stanley Cup since we last talked.
I'm sure people were upset we didn't do a podcast recapping that.
Probably the Lightning themselves. Probably the members of the Lightning have felt our support, and then where did we go? I was with you, Lightning, watching it on an 11-inch TV in Montana in some hotel.
Yeah.
But I watched it. They brought it home. Back-to-back, Pastor.
Back-to-back. Pretty impressive. I did watch the last game, and as people know, I'm not a big hockey guy, but I watched it. Very excited for the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Rays are in first place, I think, and the Bucks are getting ready to kick off.
That's right.
Things are good in Tampa.
It's still good.
Except for the Red Tide, right?
Wait, except for the Red Tide, which I hear is rolling back finally, is some of the stuff I'm seeing. Okay, well, let's get into it today. Here's our main topic, not national parks, as you may have thought that was going to be the main topic. But there's a podcast that, hard on your podcast to support another podcast, but we're going to do that out of the goodness of our hearts. There's a podcast that's caught a lot of people's attention, and it is called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's a really well done, in my opinion, podcast by Christianity Today. And when I say well done, I mean it's very thoroughly researched. I would say, and you could speak into this, that it does a good job of even presenting some of the positive things that the Church of Mars Hill and the pastor Mark Driscoll did actively throughout his time there. And they do a good job of even saying that's kind of what makes situations like this more complicated. From far away, they seem real black and white because you've never, but at one point in the podcast, I don't want to get too. It's easy. I'm excited about this topic. But at one point, they highlight he was like buying groceries for a ton of single.
They did a lot of good things. A lot of people heard the gospel, and that again, you're exactly right. So what makes these situations difficult is because it's never as black and white as sometimes people want it to be. It's messy in these situations. There's a lot of good in with the bad, and it's just hard to overgeneralize these kind of situations.
So for those of you that maybe are just not familiar at all with any of these names I just said, the story kind of is anchored around the pastor of Mars Hill, whose name was Mark Driscoll. He rose to popularity in like the early 2000s, probably maybe early to first 10 years of the 2000s. He was really starting to rise, became a very popular speaker at events and conferences, authored several books. I think was even sort of on the front end of this video Bible study thing that a lot of pastors do now. So Mark was this early kind of, for lack of a better term, rock star in evangelical circles. He was just very popular. It was a big conference if Mark Driscoll was speaking there. And he was pastoring this church called Mars Hill in Seattle, Washington. And it wasn't that long ago, I think, that it kind of all I don't have that year in front of me.
Yeah, I don't know the exact year, but it's within the last decade. It may have been 5-6 years ago now that, it kind of came to a crisis, and he stepped away, and the church has more or less imploded. Some of the congregations may have morphed into other congregations, but the church as an entity no longer exists. At one time, it was one of the largest churches in America.
Right. Many campuses, and there was it all kind of came out of the way that Mark was leading the staff internally, the way he was handling some situations with congregants that disagreed with him. And yes, the fallout was very messy. They had campuses, and I believe their decision was just every campus became either their own church or that was their call. But they were essentially like disassociated with all campuses. Very messy fallout. I happen to have friends in Seattle around that time that walked through it very closely. They weren't going to one, but they, of course, a lot of evangelical Christians in the area. The ripple was very, very much felt by everybody. So I wanted to ask you a couple questions about that. Hopefully that's a good summary for the story. Again, you can get more details online. You can listen to the podcast. The podcast is fantastic. I would recommend it if you're interested. Should say before we go further on that, though, that the content is not for children. I wouldn't say.
Yeah, there's some rough content in there.
It doesn't curse. They block out cursing and things, but just if you were,
there's some heavy discussions about sexuality, how you treat women. There were some moments there, and they do a good job to warn you about that. So it's just, I wouldn't sit down with the kids and
that's all I'm
family
saying.
devotional.
Right? It's Christianity Today that's making it, so it's not like it's done haphazardly. So anyway, I wanted to ask you some about this, Pastor, and kind of I don't know. I guess like one of my first thoughts is you pastored during this time. I guess how much do you remember about the ascension of Mark Driscoll?
Pretty good bit. I mean, he became there's this whole phenomenon the last 20 years, 30 years of a celebrity pastor. And, I mean, there have always been notable pastors, so I'm not saying that's unique, but it became a thing in the last 25 years where these pastors, these churches blew up, and almost overnight, out of nowhere, these churches were planted. We think of Willow Creek in Chicago. We think of Saddleback in California. They were planted, these churches, in the 70s. By the 90s, they're two of the largest churches in America.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you never had that phenomena. I mean, you would have churches that were large, and but usually they were established, and they weren't necessarily first-generation churches. Now you are having churches that were being planted, and within 15 to 20 years, they're larger than any church that exists. And in America. So you had this. And then there were more. There's, North Point in Atlanta, and on the list can go. And Mark Driscoll was one of those. It was almost a kind of second wave. In some ways, they saw themselves as a reaction to the church growth movement of Saddleback Willow Creek. Which was the in thing for a while. And then they were kind of this almost a reaction, but the podcast talks about really they're just an extension of it. And it was a very good discussion of that. So I was very aware of it. All of a sudden, Mark starts writing books. He's a very good, again, this doesn't happen without guys who are very talented. I mean, they're very talented. I mean, you don't even have to be a Christian to go, the guy's a good speaker, right? If he's a comedian, he'd been a good comedian. If he's a motivator, he's a good motivator. And then, of course, he seemed to be very grounded in his theology, became very reformed in his theology, more than I am, but very, we would say gospel-oriented in terms of the fundamentals of the gospel, a high view of Scripture, a belief in the exclusivity of Jesus, and those gospel things. And in Seattle, one of the most secular cities in America.
Right.
So we kind of celebrated that, and you had this huge church that just blows up overnight, and he's speaking in all these conferences and writing books. So yeah, I was very aware of it. There is a almost a cottage industry for a while. I'm wondering if it's waning now, but of church planners who would plant a church, it would blow up. It would just catch wind, and the wind would be in the sails, and the next thing you know, they go from 0 to 10,000.
Yeah.
And you're like, they got 10,000, they got 15,000 people coming, and they're writing books, and they become nationally known brands, nationally known celebrities. Most of them are non-denominational, or even if they're connected to a denomination, very quasi-connected. And so, yes, I was extremely aware of it, and it kind of began to define evangelical life in America, these massive, influential, largely non-denominational churches that just blew up and became something big.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. Man, so many follow-up questions just washed over me at the same time, one of which is just... again, I'm just asking your perspective on this as the leader of a church. And for those of you that maybe have not been able to visit Calvary here in person, we're not a small church by any means.
Right.
We're not nearly as big as I think Mars Hill was in its heyday.
No.
But you're leading a church. You're leading a pretty sizable church here. Is there anything in you when you hear these stories, when you go back through these stories? I mean, what? They seem way too commonplace now, of a leader that gets off track and the things kind of fall apart. How do you respond to them right now in the stage that you're in? Is it I guess what I would anticipate is there's a bit of getting tired of hearing this story kind of over and over again.
Well, I've been in ministry a long time, 37 years, and one of the things I remember hearing as a young pastor is that there's a lot of guys you're going to see that rise and fall. And a lot of the guys who start with you aren't going to finish with you. And, that's played out. Over the years, as you get older, one of the things about age is you see perspective. And it's a good thing, really. I've been old enough to see that whoever the hot singer is right now, whoever that is, I don't know who that is.
Olivia Rodrigo, Pastor.
Okay, there she is. Olivia.
The new Taylor Swift.
Is she? Okay. Well, see, that's the first time I've ever heard her name. Okay, that's good. So I've got to, but there'll be the hot thing, but I've lived long enough to see that the hot thing doesn't last too long. Give it 15 years. And everything will be on sale. Believe me. I mean, it's like, and your kids will be laughing at you for, you listen to that.
Yeah, right.
So that's just, time, you get that perspective. And when you're younger, you don't see that. The big thing is the big thing. It's the biggest thing that's ever been or ever will be. This is the cool. We have redefined coolness in my generation. Yeah, just wait about 20 years.
Yeah.
And so I've seen it. And unfortunately now I've seen it in church life where there's some things that these churches have in common also that's it's worth noting. They're almost all church plants. These are all first-generation churches. And the podcast did a great job of tracing this back even to Robert Schuller and the Crystal Cathedral, which I do remember from my boyhood time. That was one of those churches that came out of nowhere. And I think the church growth movement, which I came into ministry being heavily influenced by the church growth movement. How do you grow your church? How do you reach more people? That became the definition of success. And there's a deep well to go into there of how we've made a mistake by equating church growth with biblical evangelism and assuming that if a church was growing, it was doing evangelism.
Yeah.
And that is a false assumption. The two are related, but they're not the same. So what you had it in Robert Schuller, you had it in Saddleback and Willow Creek, you have it in, some of these are still going. Rick Warren he is getting ready to retire and will apparently finish well. But you have, Andy Stanley and Catalyst. You had several that are on this major trajectory, and the churches get disproportionately large to other churches. They become the new it thing. But we have seen a lot of calamity in some of these churches that got so big, and we've seen it, at Harvest in Chicago. We've seen it at Willow Creek in Chicago, and Mars Hill is one of the most dramatic cases, which is why they're doing a podcast of it.
Yeah. And one of the things the podcast does a good job of holding up is that it would appear, and I think this is kind of one of their hypotheses behind the whole thing, that Mark's influence and stardom grew much faster than his character was able to grow. And in one of the episodes, they even trace back some of these pastors. Like you said, it's not necessarily, there was a Billy Graham an awful long time ago who had this great big influence. But he cut his teeth. It was a journey to get there. It was pastoring these very tiny churches. Even to Robert Schuller, I think he was like on a car at a drugstore.
Well, everybody starts. Like everybody does start humble. I mean, and Billy Graham, they rocketed up pretty quick. But yet, you kind of came along cutting your teeth doing some of the humble. So that may be the point. There is that even if it's a short season, there was a season when Billy was. Now, Mark would tell you, I think, because I've read some of his books, that we had that season at Mars Hill where we were. He had a funny chapter of his church play. I'm not going to quote it right, but there's a chapter of, like, they took their first offering, and he said, he got $47.52, and he wanted to use it to buy bullets. That was in his chapter. Yeah, that gives you a sense of his character, and it was funny at the time. Mm-hmm. You just thought, that's funny. But there's something there, and that may be what you're starting to get to, which is. You don't want your platform to outstrip your character. Yeah. And it's kind of like the caterpillar. There was an old story about, somebody seeing a caterpillar trying to get out of the cocoon to turn into a butterfly. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to help it, and he tried to kind of cut the cocoon open to get the butterfly out quicker because it looked like he was really struggling. And then the butterfly fell out and died. And the point was that the butterfly needed to work its wings, that there was something in the struggle that made it stronger and made it able to fly when it came out. And if you took that part of the process away, it actually crashed. And again, I haven't studied butterflies. I don't know that that's it's a good preacher story, but heard it somewhere. Yeah. But there is truth in that, I think, in life, that we learn some things in the struggle that help us. And I think when you look at some of the major crises in evangelical life that we could call the guys, one of the things they have in common is they were church planners. Mm-hmm. They planted their church. They were largely disconnected with any other denominational structure. If they were, it was very loose. Yeah. And they grew quickly and overnight. They kind of hit on something that nobody else was doing. Right. They explode. But they're not prepared from the standpoint of character. They don't have people in their life that hold them accountable. When they're getting out of line, there was no structure in place. Yeah. There was no structure existing in the church for people to go, wait a second, that's, you can't do that. Right. Well, if you planted the church and you're the founding pastor, you kind of can. It's like, I was here before you were. Yeah. And so it seems like there have been a disproportionate number of those who rocketed to influence and a kind of stardom, a celebrity status, and then crashed just as quickly. And I think one of the theories is, you know what, there is something to having accountability structures in place. There is something to having struggled in almost anonymity, where nobody's paying attention to you, and you learn to do it for the Lord and the people and not for the applause of man. The bright lights and the applause of crowds are dangerous things. Yeah. And if you can't handle them, they will take you out. Yeah. And so I guess as I'm listening to this, and you alerted me and maybe some of the other staff members and just said this is a really good podcast. I don't know if you guys have heard it yet. So I'm just curious from your standpoint, because what it came down to here with Mark was how he was leading. And this is the thing about this podcast. Some of these quotes he's saying them at a conference. He's saying them from his church pulpit. Yeah. They now look back and cringe. Very abusive. For those that don't know the story, it wasn't a moral in terms of we tend to think of sexual immorality or there were money issues, but it was more temperament in how people were treated. Right. And the belligerence, the kind of arrogance, the pushing the envelope and what you would talk about and how you would say things, almost the shock jock value of, I can't believe a preacher would say that. He was known for a time as the cussing preacher. Right. Mainly because occasionally he would throw in a rough word. Right. And, and didn't seem to mind. Yeah. I don't know that he cussed that much, but I don't know. That became a moniker. Yeah. He bragged about, getting together with guys and drinking beer. One of his chapters of one of his books is called The Sin of Light Beer. And his sin was, are you drinking light beer? That's the sin. He wants, and it's a shock jock because he knows what a lot of other people in churches were going to go, oh, you can't do that. And he could. The point is, I think when there are no guardrails on the road, you're in a dangerous place. Guardrails are there for a reason.
Yeah.
Accountability is there for a reason. And as constraining as sometimes they feel, and they can feel that way in church life. I can tell you a lot of churches that are struggling because, some people put guardrails that kept a leader from doing anything.
Right.
But there's a healthy balance between, being tied up in a pen where you can't do anything, and then driving on a curvy mountain road with no guardrails.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so glad that's what you got onto, because that's exactly what I was going to ask. As a leader in your position, I mean, I guess my first question is, do you see this temptation that is, I wish everyone would just do what I say. I wish everyone would just do. I mean, Mark at one point says there's a pile of bodies behind the Mars Hill bus.
Yes.
Like I'm not stopping for anybody. Is that something you see, you've experienced? Like, boy, wouldn't that be nice?
Yes.
Is that a thing?
I think maybe every leader does. I think it's quite common, and I think it's one of the reasons when Mark was rocketing to his celebrity set, people were listening to it. And believe me, that's like a narcotic to pastors who are struggling in churches where they can't get anything done. Mm-hmm. And then you hear this big, strong, macho-talking guy like, there's a pile of bodies behind the bus, and we're coming, and you want to go, wow, I need a little of that juice. Mm-hmm. I need a little of that. And by the way, there's some guys I think need a little of that juice. It's like step up and lead, man, and be willing to confront some people. But like everything, there is a balance. And so, yes, there's a temptation. And I think when you lead there, I've been frustrated when I couldn't get people to do things I wanted them to do, particularly as a younger leader, because I would come up with a decision and put it out there and think everybody's going to think this is brilliant, wonderful. Yeah, I'm thinking of some now, almost embarrassing. And then being frustrated when it would be questioned.
Yeah.
Like, and you want to go, hey, who are you to question? You called me. I'm the pastor. Like, do this. And there were a couple of times I went home and pouted a few days because, somebody, was questioning it. And honestly, I'm still not above it. I can be hard-headed and probably don't like being told no. But I think as you age, you learn. I need people in my life to ask the hard questions. And they're not against me. And this is what I would say to younger leaders. People that say no, or even that may criticize you or that disagree with you, aren't your enemies. They only become your enemies if you let them become your enemies. And there were stories in the podcast that were told where you look back and you want to go, oh, Mark, I wish you had listened to that person. They weren't your enemy.
Right.
There's a story about his administrative assistant who had a statement, and she was not his enemy at all. Mm-mm. She loved him. Right. What she was saying was she thought was trying to be helpful, and she had made a statement of he needs some men in his life, some strong men who can tell him no. He just fired her, and he accused her of heresy, which is laughable. That's not disagreeing with somebody is not heresy. And I do think in church life, I think other organizations are also susceptible, but I certainly think in church life there is a susceptibility to a leader who can become so enamored with his own gifts and so driven. And what fools you is I'm doing the Lord's work. I think I'm doing the right thing, and I'm pushing. And you allow people, who disagree with you or criticize you, you allow it to become a personal animosity instead of saying, hey, maybe they got something here. Yeah. Maybe I need to listen here. Maybe I need to work on this a little bit longer. Right. And I am not a fan of church structures, and not every church that does this has fallen as prolific, as publicly as Mars Hill did. But there are churches that I'm still not a fan of their structure because there's nobody there who can tell the pastor no. There's nobody the pastor's coming to saying, hey, I'd like to try this, this, and this. Here are our thoughts. What are your questions, feedback? As we record this podcast, I meet with our deacons tonight. I meet with the administrative committee of our church immediately after that. So it'll be a late night tonight. And I go into those meetings with an agenda. And there are things which I will be sharing with these very bright people who are leaders in our church, but that's a discipline. It's a discipline we need to go through because I need to sit down with them and go, okay, here's the way we're thinking about this situation. Here's the way we're thinking about this situation. Here's what we want to do about this situation. And they get to speak into it. Mm-hmm. And they're very supportive of me as the pastor. Believe me, I am blessed to be the pastor here.
Yeah.
They're not nitpicking. They're not small-minded people. But we need to have strong men and women in key positions of authority who can look over our shoulder and say, this is what I think about that. I think you're doing too much of this or not enough of that. And, I think when churches get to where they don't have those structures in place, human beings are just going to screw up at some point.
Yeah.
And if you don't have those guardrails in place, you're liable to go right off the cliff.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard a saying once. I'm not sure where. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, it's a famous quote, and there's a certain degree of truth to it because even if you are a very effective leader, and even if you have the best motives in the world,
right,
you're forgetting that you're a sinner first of all, and you struggle with temptations like everyone else. So if you don't have guardrails, you're in trouble. But you can become so driven and so confident that you are doing the right thing that sometimes you don't know where your blind spots are.
Yeah.
And some of the greatest crashes in history have come because of leaders who were effective many, 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 many times, and then they get into a situation and they just do the same thing they've always done before, and they didn't have somebody in there looking over their shoulder. They didn't have anybody who could tell them no, and the next thing you know, it's trouble. Because this situation isn't like all the others before. It was a different situation.
Right. So let me ask you this then, because, we're definitely a church that has proven to have a vision, be chasing after a vision. What are some things you've learned about, you're trying to explain a vision, you're trying to move in a direction, and somebody pushes back and somebody raises a concern? What have you learned as far as, is this person kind of coming with their own agenda? This person's got some of their own personal stuff. This person really liked the way we used to do things, and they're not keen on doing things a new way, versus, this is a legitimate concern.
Well, I think that's a great question, and because you don't want to give a person a veto power. There are people that will oppose things or disagree with things, and I don't think one person gets to veto what a large group of people believe God is calling them to do. But I think, first of all, you consider the source. You consider the person. Mm-hmm. You're trying to get the best leaders around you who really are smart, good, spiritual, godly, grounded leaders, and then you listen to them. So you consider the source. If the criticism or the opposition is coming from somebody that's not very invested, or they're always, you kind of consider that. But there are men and women that when they speak into a situation, I'm listening because I just trust them. I trust them. So first of all, I consider the source. Then you consider the substance. You ask yourself, what are they saying? What are their concerns? Very often when a person expresses a concern about a matter, the issue is not the issue. I've said this for years. Whenever I hear about somebody who gets fired in a church, I usually say the issue is not the issue. They'll tell you, the issue was he slept in one Sunday and was late. We fired him, and that's what the pastor will say. Can you believe they fired me? I was late one time. And, well, I go, I don't think that's I always know that's not the issue.
Yeah.
The issue is you had already lost trust with those people over a long period. If they fired you because you were late one Sunday, which I can't imagine a guy being late, but if they fired you, let's say it happened. You did not listen to the podcast. You did not get the new schedule. You work on staff at Calvary, and you're 15 minutes late.
Right.
Okay. Well, if everything else is strong, you reprimand somebody for not getting their facts straight and say, hey, don't let it happen again. But if on the other hand, a person has over the past several years demonstrated that they are irresponsible, unreliable, they are late all the time, they don't pay attention even when they've been told, and then it can become the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. It's over time that caused the issue became the issue because there were other issues.
Right.
So when somebody criticizes you or offers something, I want to know what the real issue is. I want to go, okay, is there a deeper issue? And sometimes you got to dig around there. Sometimes you got to listen. So consider the substance. And then at the end of the day, you're asking yourself, you just try to look at the big picture of where you're going. You listen to the criticism. You receive it. Sometimes you need to keep pressing on because a majority of people are with you and you have a consensus. But sometimes you need to listen to that. And even if you disagree, their opinion still helps you form a better opinion. One of the reasons I want to be surrounded by really good leaders is because I want them to ask all the questions that the church is going to ask. So that if we come up with an idea and say, we're going to do this, I'm not going to be surprised when I find out that, oh, there's a whole group of people that were concerned about this. I want to know that beforehand. I like wherever church meeting, I like to think I can anticipate any question that could come up. Now, I can't. There are questions that catch me out of the blue. But I want to have thought through every conceivable question a person can ask.
Right.
And treat it with respect. And I think sometimes, again, I don't want to be unfair, but I think sometimes these guys that become super celebrities, super big, they become impressed with their own gifts. Everybody around them is very impressed with them.
Yeah.
They don't have anybody that can tell them no. And then they don't listen where they should have listened, and they plow ahead into a great mistake. So anyway, that's how I think you try to distinguish those things.
Yeah, and I think it's so good. And you've touched on earlier. You mentioned tonight you have a meeting, I think, with our deacons and some of our teams, and you've mentioned it previously on the podcast that every time you start a session with the deacons, which is like them being on in that role for a term, you say I need you guys to hold me accountable.
Yep.
You give them that.
This is the group that's got to say something. This is the group. I often tell them. I said, look, if there's a problem at this church, if there's going to be some real leadership issue, I said, you cannot be the guys that are looking around going, I hope somebody ought to do something. I hope somebody does something. I said, you're it. It's like you can't call the fire department. You are the fire department.
Right.
Pick up a hose and let's get to work. And I invite them to do that. I want them to do that. And then we have, we talk about our structure sometimes. We have a big group of deacons, and we're talking about big issues with them. But then I have a smaller group that's called our Deacon Leadership Council. That's a smaller group of leaders, and we bring them in and we talk to them. And that's a group where I can even get a little deeper. And I say, you're the group that's got to be willing to ask me the hard question. You're the group that's got to press through whatever awkwardness there is or uncomfortableness there is. And you've got to be empowered to say, hey, I got a question. I see something here. And I think when they hear me say that, they understand we mean it. I hope I demonstrate to them that I mean it. And because occasionally I'll get people who are impatient around me who go, why are you spending the time why don't you just charge ahead? And my answer is because I think there's wisdom in building a strong consensus of leaders so that we can keep everybody on the same page.
Yeah, and I think there's, for anybody out there in a leadership position or aspiring to be in a leadership position, it's interesting because I'm hearing this stuff in this podcast and some of the issues that were born out of that. And there's a spirit of this that is I know feels very present in my generation, probably is just an ever-present thing, particularly in America, where our history comes from. We do our own thing. We weren't going to be just part of the monarchy. We were going to go be our own country. So there's a little bit of that feels baked in here of I want to do my own thing. And I've noticed that you want to start your own company. Being an entrepreneur is like, as a millennial, that's like the thing.
You're going to start your own church.
Start your own church.
We're going to start, and I believe in church planting. We're trying to plant churches.
Yeah.
But it drew a certain group of people like, we're going to go do it right. We see this traditional church, and they've gotten off track. They've gotten off mission. We're going to be. And you know what? I love that entrepreneurial spirit because I think we need church planters and new churches and new leaders. And there's a certain wiring for that. But the strength can become the weakness if you don't balance that with a good, strong accountability system and a good, strong structure in place. The thing that some of those guys looked at established churches like Calvary, been around over 150 years.
Yeah.
They look at it and they go, you got structure, you got this, and we don't want any of that. Well, okay, you might be able to move faster on some things.
Right.
But I think that, and that's fine. But the weakness will be you're going to get out there at some point, and if you're not careful, you can have a system where you don't have people holding you accountable, and you have one guy who thinks he's what it's all about.
Yeah.
And when you have a church, I'll say this: when you have a church that's built on one guy and his gifts and his talent and his gravitas, you're in, look, you're one heart attack away from having a crisis, right? And I don't just mean a crisis or a bad day. I mean, if it's built on one guy, he's one stupid decision away from the entire church being in trouble.
Right.
And that's where I think people get into trouble. And
Yeah.
I think as a leader, I want to lead, and I hope that I demonstrate that, and I want to come with a vision and an agenda. I don't apologize. I think that's what leaders do. But I also want strong leaders around us who are, first of all, part of a team so that they're vetting that, and then congregational leaders who are listening and vetting. And I think there's a balance there that's important.
Yeah. I wanted to camp there a second, talking to these specific people who that might be ringing some bells for you, because a lot of times I think you do have to seek that out. We're talking about the church context a lot, but whatever profession you might be in, or if you've started your own business, or if you're striking out on your own doing anything, it's so important, I think, to have some good people speaking into your life. And it will, and I'll tell you this, it will slow you down a little bit. You'll move a little slower because you're trying to get a couple thoughts before you move forward at the breakneck speed.
And you're thinking, I got to get this guy in, what does this guy think? What does this guy think? And it might be a little slower. And I don't want unnecessary bureaucracy getting in the way. But sometimes a little slower might be, especially if you're about to run off the bridge.
Yeah,
It'd be good to go a little slower just to make sure somebody is looking around and seeing things that maybe you don't see.
Yeah.
And that's why I just think in general, as you're saying, it's important to have counselors and wise people speaking into your life.
I want to switch gears a little bit. Just a couple more questions on this, and we'll wrap up. And this one's definitely a gear switch. I just thought it was an interesting segment of the podcast. If you're anything like me, maybe I think this was my first introduction to Mark Driscoll, was this viral video clip of him sort of like screaming at the top of his lungs during his sermon. And this was an interesting thing. I just wanted your glimpse into this little phenomenon. So he does this, and the podcast played a clip of him talking about that and saying, it was a very in the moment thing, and he did it in the moment. Well, lo and behold, he did it 7 times. He did it every single service he did, and the person doing the podcast just had commented on it was a little bit performative. It was very at the camera, and it was very theatrical. You can imagine, and when I say screaming, I mean like, he was top of his lungs screaming at this camera. You have to listen to the podcast or look up the clip. So I just wanted your thoughts on this really quickly. You're delivering a message, right? And you've done this for multiple times. We're in a season now where we were doing one service a week. You're doing it multiple times. How do you toe this line of it being performative versus it being you're delivering a message that's right now in this moment to these people that are in this room?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a certain amount of preaching, I suppose, that can be performative in that you are trying sometimes to drive home a point or to make an illustration or to create an emotional connection to a story. And I guess there's a performative element to that where you're putting emotion into it. And I feel very emotional when I preach. I probably yell too much for some people or get too animated because I do feel. I mean, you're genuinely excited or angry or whatever. People don't want fake.
Yeah.
That's the difference. You just don't want fake. And I think, the greasy thing about that is it really felt like it was this spontaneous thing when
right.
It probably wasn't. And
no, they said he rehearsed it.
Yeah, so that's and it was dramatic. It was dramatic. I think people were sharing that clip with me years ago. I saw that clip, and some people were really impressed by it. Can you believe? And because he was chewing men out, he was like saying, it's time for you. And we won't go into everything he said, but he was just chewing the men out. Well, again, there's a point of that where, again, he was reaching a lot of young males who were coming out of this culture where they weren't, they hadn't been taught to be strong men and to marry and become fathers and get jobs. He was like punching them in the face, and probably a lot of middle-aged parents were bringing their sons, like, listen to this guy. You need to get out of the living room and get a job, son.
Yeah.
So again, some of what he's saying was good. But I think the way he said it really did seem somewhat demeaning, So I don't know how to answer your question. I think the difference between performative and authentic probably comes down to your motives a lot. What are you trying to do? Why are you trying to do it? And if that had been an isolated case, we wouldn't worry about it. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. The reality is, it became symptomatic of an abusive tendency where a person could yell and be belligerent and unkind to others. And that story then becomes Exhibit A.
Yeah.
Whatever your giftedness, if you are not demonstrating consistently over time the fruit of the Spirit, and again, we all have bad moments.
Yeah.
Okay, I certainly have mine. But if you are not over time with numbers of people in difficult situations demonstrating love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, the fruit of the Holy Spirit. That's the fruit of the Holy Spirit in your life. And you see instead arrogance and abrasiveness and not gentleness, the opposite of gentleness, the opposite of patience. Patience, gentleness, kindness. And in some of these leaders, you just weren't seeing that. There was very little patience, very little kindness, very little, gentleness. And then something's missing. What's missing is the Holy Spirit. What's missing is the Holy Spirit. And I think that's what people look back on now and say, wow, something got off track there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I kind of wanted to land the podcast here on this point because I think if you listen to the podcast, like I said, the person who's doing the podcast, whose name I forgot to write down, but is doing a fantastic job and has kept this at the front of the story, is the people that are hurt by situations like this. And you could go really far with that because Mark's pastoral ministry and his teaching went really far. He wrote books. He was super down. His podcast was very downloaded. All millions of views on YouTube. So who feels this when it comes to light that this is how he's acting behind closed doors, that this is the way he's treating his staff?
Yeah.
These stories weren't public. They're being made public now, but what this story with his administrative or his executive assistant, it wasn't a public story at the time. So I guess to this person, because this person, in quotes, is becoming more common. There's more and more churches that, some of them very big and publicly, are falling apart because a pastor is leading in this not exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit, like you just said, or maybe it is a more legal or moral failure that's a little bit more traditional. To the person that's in that church, that was blessed by that church, because I think that's what this podcast hones in on. I'm one of the worship leaders is on there saying, my daughter was baptized.
Yeah, there's a reason people go to those churches.
Yep. So how do you, I guess, if you've been hurt by a church.
There's a lot of people like that, and there are a lot of ways to get hurt by a church. So we could exhaust it'd be difficult to exhaust the list in describing ways in which some churches are very legalistic, some churches are very deceptive, some leaders. Anyway, a lot of people have been hurt by churches. And in fact, I was witnessing to a guy last night. I was in Atlanta yesterday, and I was coming back and being driven in a car to. They had a driver service to get me to the airport, which was nice. And his name was Elijah, and I got to talking to Elijah, and it was a great conversation. Tried to share the gospel with him, and did. But he was, 25 and talking about his dad and, the relationship there being dicey, and that his dad was very involved in a church, but I could just tell he didn't care for the church. And, what I tried to say to Elijah, I would say to you is separate the message of a church from the message of Jesus. You have to understand that people get in the way. God uses all kinds of people. That's the beautiful thing. Paul says we are earthen jars. We're like clay pots, but we carry a treasure inside. Occasionally, the clay pot is going to look pretty ugly. Occasionally, it's going to look pretty human. Occasionally, it may fail you. Occasionally, it may even hurt you. But the message of Jesus won't. Jesus won't fail you. And I guess what I would say is, if to a person that has been hurt or wounded by a church or a church leader or a church situation, is at some point you're going to have to distinguish. And I know it can be hard to do.
Yeah.
You're going to have to distinguish between the person and the message of Jesus and the person and the message of the person who hurt you. And Jesus is not that. And God can even use a really, a flawed individual to still, maybe you heard the message of Jesus. I've talked to people who were baptized by pastors who later fell morally or whatever.
Yeah.
And they go, is my baptism good? Yes.
Yeah.
Because you weren't being baptized in that person's name. You were being baptized into the body of Christ because of the work of Jesus in your life. And so what I encouraged my friend last night was to go back and just read the Bible. I said, go back, and he promised me he would. I said, go back and read, because he really is thinking about God. He wasn't like he was turned off. In fact, he thanked me for talking to him about God. But I said, go back and read the Gospels, because that church may be crazy. I laughed. I said, believe me, I know there's some crazy churches out there. So just put that aside right now. I said, go back and look at the message of Jesus, because I think you'll find the message of Jesus is beautiful beyond compare. So I guess that's what I would say to those who have been hurt. I'm sorry you've been hurt. First of all, we want to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
We want to acknowledge you have been hurt. There are some people who are jerks. There are people who have misused people. There are things that I am embarrassed by when I see them happen in churches. I wish they hadn't happened. But separate that from the message of Jesus. Jesus will never let you down. And the message of Jesus is beautiful. And once you get that, then you begin to see that he's got a lot of people out there, a lot of churches out there that are beautiful also. They're imperfect, but they're beautiful places because the message of Jesus is there, and the worship of Jesus is there. I would say to somebody from our Hill, look, I'm sorry that happened. It's beyond painful. We got to learn lessons from it. But it doesn't mean that if you were introduced to Jesus there, that's wrong.
Yeah.
Now, you might need to separate some of the other stuff.
Yeah.
But the message of the gospel, that's what's beautiful, and that's what you got to hang on to.
So true. So good. Like I said, the name of the podcast, if you're curious, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's put out by Christianity Today. They're doing a great job with that. Thank you, Pastor. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that.
Good to get back and talk.
We're back. The Ricecast is back. We might next week, I think we might be out, but we're back. Really, we're back. It's fall.
We won't be able to get together next week, so don't camp out in front of Anthony's house.
They're going to be back, Pastor. I know they're going to be back.
Just don't make too much noise.
Don't make
too much noise.
Don't startle the dogs. That's all I ask.
The neighbors are, but we'll be back in 2 weeks, and I just have some speaking next week I have to do, so I'm here the next 2 Sundays I'm here, but during the week I'll be traveling some. But then after that, we should be on a pretty regular flow. That's right. We look forward to this Sunday. Get plugged into a group. Find a way to get plugged into a group. If you're out of town, calvary.us, calvary.us/groups. That's where you can get plugged in. We want to see everybody connecting this fall. We know we need it. We know how important it is. It's a core value for us here at Calvary Community. So get plugged into a group this week. New fall kickoff schedule the following week. Lots of fun stuff. And we'll be back here with the Ricecast again very soon.